Hello, students. This is Doug Thiel, your instructor, and this is about the Peter Singer essay. Now, you've already done a discussion board on this, and there were some people that really took their time and did a really good job on their first post, which was always good to see. We're not leaving this essay alone. We still got work to do on it, and there'll be some homework where you're going to be identifying how he responds to counter arguments. Now, in terms of our criterions for a good argument, a rebuttal component is one of them. In other words, a person who tries to advocate a position needs to be aware of what would count against what they're trying to advocate for and then respond to it. And since you're going to be doing the same thing later on, especially when when quiz 4 comes along, and you have to take one of the elements of the Singer essay and kind of write your mini position paper on that element. This is a developmental process to get you to a point where when we do the final term paper, which is all essay, that you will have an opportunity to maximize the full points. So let's jump into this. In terms of Peter Singer's orientation, he is what's known as a utilitarian. Now, this is a moral theory. It's not something we're studying in this class, but if you continue on and take another philosophy class, you'll probably be introduced to to moral theories. Utilitarianism comes from the Enlightenment. It's a theory kind of very simply based on the principle that morality should be something that makes things better, that gives us happiness over pain. It was allowed to be spoken about because prior to that, prior before the Enlightenment, in Western civilization, the church told everyone what morality was, and still does in some cases for people who are involved in that faith-based enterprise. But philosophy is not religion in that sense. It's about critical thinking. It's about preventing rationales that would appeal to a believer or a non-believer, which is how we are going to do our work in this class. We're going to use our critical thinking skills. But back to the philosophy of utilitarianism, that was a philosophy that said, okay, so now let's look at things differently. So if something creates a better overall state of affairs, all persons considered, then that's a good deal. We should work for that. We should be proactive. We should be looking down the road, trying to make things better. And if we have moral intuitions, whether it comes from past philosophy or a religious orientation that stands in the way of that, we should modify it. We should be focused on consequences. And so sometimes this theory is also called consequentialism. All right, so now let's go to what Peter Singer is suggesting. Peter Singer wrote that essay about famine, and a horrible thing where people are born sometimes into a situation where they almost guaranteed to starve to death before they reach any kind of a timeline. This is a horrible thing, and Peter Singer tries to make a convincing argument that we need to do much more than we're currently doing. And of course, his article was written many years ago, and the problem still persists. And it kind of gave him a reputation in philosophy that's stayed to this very day. And he starts out with a analogy. So let's say you're walking down the road and you see this, poor little kid drowning in a small pool of water, and of course you're going to pick him up out of that, even if you just put on your best, suit, pants, or your best dress or whatever. And the only really cost to you is cleaning your dirty clothing, but you save this young man's life or young lady's life, a young child. Of course you do that. And he says, well, okay, now let's run with that. So why do we have famine anywhere in the world? We're a global village, etc. I'm going to be dealing more with this, like I said, in quiz 4. Well, as a critical thinker, you've got to take a good look at this. It may be that in the final analysis, you support what Singer's trying to sell, and you just need, when you do support that, especially in that 4th quiz, you've got to be able to answer criticisms to that position. Now, analogy. Is this analogy, does this have any issues with being possibly a faulty analogy? Is the world a global village? are because what Peter Singer's trying to convince you is, look, if you'd save the drowning child just for a small expense, to have your clothes cleaned, then why don't you? It would certainly be something you should be doing with famine relief. You should be sending your money to famine relief because the same thing's happening. Children are starving. Doesn't really seem to take into account the problems of that analogy, in the sense that saving that child is an action that happens on the spot, something that you can see and know what you've done. Sending money to famine relief can be a pretty sketchy thing, especially with as many scams that take place anytime a disaster or a bad situation happens. People see an opportunity to make some money. We're seeing that now. This video is recorded during the pandemic of the COVID-19, and it's already happening. People will take advantage of that, and sometimes you send charitable contributions to a place where you don't get to see what happens. And with a child, you do. So that's an issue. Now whether that is definitive in the sense that Singer's off course is another question. That's an open question for you to think about. But you need to see at least some of the practical problems that happen. And then you have to understand this whole notion of role responsibility in terms of moral obligations. We clearly have a stronger responsibility. This is kind of what happened again in the Goodman essay, to what's happening in our local area over what's happening worldwide. Because in our local area, whether it be our family, where we have some input and participation in the family process, we don't have input and participation in the governments and the way of life in other countries. They have their own way of doing things, and we really don't have a voice. And it would seem like, to be in a global village, you would have to have a voice. You'd have to be part of the total decision-making process, and even if you sometimes didn't, your particular viewpoint didn't carry, you would go along with the will of the majority of the people in your village, because you were allowed to participate in deciding how things get done. It doesn't happen in with other countries. They decide their own way of doing things and their own government structure, and so they live in a silo, so to speak, that's different than the one that we live in, and that has that has an effect on any notion of moral responsibility. Once again, go back to the Goodman article on the AZT distribution. When you have countries that only allowed $11 for medical aid, and another country comes in to try to do some charitable distribution, does that mean that country, if it doesn't do the distribution in the same way that we do the distribution in a country where we do have a voice, that we're morally indecent? That double standard is a faulty moral standard. So these are the things you need to think about, and I'm not trying to necessarily with this video discouraging you from your own independent thinking, because essentially when you write the quiz 4, you will be looking at 3 different kinds of essays, topics that you could choose. You'll choose one, and it's an I paper. You need to take ownership of this. It's just that what I'm pointing out to you is, when you read something the first time, and maybe everything sounds really great, you need to take another look at. That's what it means to do critical thinking, and say, okay, so the thesis is basically, in Peter Singer's case, is kind of that charity, the whole concept of charity needs to change from just something that it's nice for you to do and you can do it when you want to it's more mandatory than you think. It's a moral obligation, and then he uses these other examples to help support that. So that needs to be considered, because normally speaking, that's not how we think of charity. We think of charity as something that you can do, but you're not morally indecent if in one or two cases you don't do this. In other words, you don't spend all your time thinking about what can I do that won't be of significant impact on me? I mean, should I go to this first run movie? Should I buy this new piece of clothing or whatever, or should I just give that to famine relief? It's an interesting kind of argument that needs some, like I said, some critical thinking, because if persons were, I guess the best way to say this is if everyone was required to be a utilitarian in all facets of your life, it would radically change the landscape. And if you were to bring that up to Peter Singer, he would say, yeah, and your point? See, he wants that to change. He believes that's the only way to eradicate some of these long-standing problems. But in doing so, you have to be willing to embrace the theory, not only when it's convenient for you or when you would like to do something without having to worry as having this expense would be better off being sent to some charity. And of course, I already stated the problems of that. But does a moral agent have some freedom to decide when it's appropriate for them to donate, to give charitably? And that's usually how we've thought of this. I don't want to go much longer because I had a prior video in the course shell that was longer. I'm not sure it was any more effective in terms of stimulating you to look at all sides of this issue. And the other thing about that, it was a format that I'm not sure people were finding easy to use. I was using Adobe Connect, and I'm converting everything now to YouTube videos so that there'll be no issues about watching them. Continue on with the course. We like I said, we are transitioning. We're trying to make use now of some of what we've learned about fallacies, how to do some critical thinking skills, how to apply the elements of a good argument. And so I have another video before you write quiz 4 that'll kind of just talk about the structure of what you're going to do. In other words, how you're going to organize your paper in terms of its elements, and it's not complicated. This video is more designed to kind of get you to think a little bit more about the essay, take another read of it, and you'll do that when you do the Peter Singer homework, and that'll allow you to pick out how he defends his own argument from those that might present the counter argument. Well, I'm going to shut this down, and hopefully everyone will have a good week, and I look forward to seeing your future work, and usually, like I said, get back to you very quickly. Continue on, and we'll see each other again in another video. Okay, take care.